I'd just like to thank you for listening to my presentation. And this presentation, I titled it Francis B. Nyamjo's The Travels of Dieudonné and the Presence of Western Scholars in Mimboland. The paper I just passed out, I just circulated, actually is a paper with a report from a French newspaper, Les Mutations. This novel was published in 2008, and nobody seemed to pay attention to it. And last year, or over time, I translated it, and it was published last year. And the French newspaper has picked on it. If you spoke French, I would play a podcast that is an adaptation of the novel, and they're already considering the possibility of getting it into a movie. So this discussion that I am undertaking here just intends to explore the ways in which Nyamjo, he's first of all a social anthropologist. I'm looking at the way he explores through his novels the presence of Western scholars in Mimboland. And Mimboland is his moniker for his native country, Cameroon, cum Amazonia. And that word Mimboland, I should elaborate on it so you understand exactly the dynamics of, when they say Mimbo, in Cameroon Pidgin English, it means alcoholic drink. So he is interested in Western scholars in the land of alcoholic drinks. Okay? And this novel depicts both endogenous and exogenous attitudes to knowledge acquisition and knowledge production. With this, I'm interested in finding out how this attitude informs the readers of this novel, of Nyamjo's narratology, his characterization, the choice of his settings, the themes, structure, and style of his work. This novel, I'll just begin by telling you briefly the story of the novel before I get into characterization. If time permits, I go into other intricacies of the novel. The novel depicts, it is told through the eyes of Dieudonné, who happened to be a refugee who has escaped his home country. The name of his home country is War Zone, and finds himself in Mimboland. And in War Zone, where he was born, his name, his birth name by his parents was Alagonga. If there is anybody who speaks Hausa here, the name Alagonga means God's truth. And so he is Islam. He is a Muslim. So he comes to Mimboland, and in his travels to get a job, to get something doing, he ends up meeting an expatriate family, the Tubabis, Mr. and Mrs. Tubabi, who accept to employ him. But they would only employ him on one condition. He must change his name. He must be re-Christianed. He must have a new name. caught in that situation, Dieudonné says, well, give me the name you want me to bear. They took him to the priest sprinkled water on his head, right? And they christened him Dieudonné, which means God-given. So God has given him to them. So he becomes their domestic servant, their footman, doing all the chores, doing the cooking and the cleaning and everything. But Dieudonné doesn't content himself with just doing the chores, because when he's done with his chores, he would go to the neighborhood of the poor people where there is a bar called Grand Canary Bar. And they said, Nyanjo says that bar is situated au Carrefour de la Joie. What he calls Carrefour de la Joie means the junction of joy. That's the junction where joy is streams. So now, what happens? We see Dieudonné telling us about his life with his masters, and he comes to the bars where everybody, depraved soul, comes to relieve themselves of their stress. He tells their story and how they produce knowledge. Now, it doesn't end the story there, because the Tubabis happen to be university professors. They are ethnologists, right? And they are supervising an African student, Dieu merci. And interestingly, the name Dieu merci simply means thank God.
Thank God.
They are supervising Dieu merci. And Dieu merci, in his own travails, trying to write his dissertation, needs access to some of the books the Tubabis have. But the Tubabis will not give him access to the book until he is reduced to a second houseboy or do some cleaning and cooking job. And when he comes to their home and they give him access to the book, they are very careful to let him know that they don't trust him, because he might steal some of the books, or he might rip some of the pages and take it away. So he has to read everything there and make sure that when he finishes, they will come and inspect before he keeps it. As a result, Dieu merci becomes acquainted to Dieudonné. Dieudonné takes him now to Grand Canary Bar. That's another strain of friendship. And now Dieu merci thinks that it would be a very good idea for him to do his dissertation, writing about his people. So this narrative continues, and we see Dieudonné, or we see Dieu merci, ending up being like a domestic servant. We never actually see him finishing his dissertation, but one thing is clear: we see him as a subservient domestic servant to the Tubabis. Now, there is something I would love to say before I go further, because in that aspect, what happens is Dieu merci, who ends up doing the cooking, doing the cleaning. His first encounter at the Tubabis, the narrator tells us something about that encounter. That's what this is what the narrator tells us. Listen, he says, both Monsieur and Madame Tubabi were busy at their books as usual, known jokingly among their students as Monsieur et Madame Ethnologie. They were members of the Association of Muzungulanda intellectuals referred to as the facilitateurs, and lecturers at the University of Asiaya, la machine à fabrication des chaleurs. I'll pause there and tell you what it means. The university where they were working is a production line for the jobless. So now, I want to pause there and let us reason that line very deeply. And I'm taking it to the colonial education that was left on Africa, or that is still prevalent in Africa today. Because you might be surprised that some African countries have many more certificated people littering their streets, doing nothing, just because of the kind of education they had. So now, what does this tell us of the Tubabis first in that space where they are supposed to educate the young Africans? What does it tell us about the discipline which they are supposed to be educating people of? Ethnology. How is ethnology going to get Africa out of the doldrums? All of these are questions we could ask and ask, okay? And the narrator tells us Dieudonné knew the couple to his fingertips, crooked and tortured by chores, though the fingers were. So they're telling you how Dieudonné's fingers were now crooked. They were tortured by the chores he had to do in the Tubabis' house. He knew them to be principled, a quality they had demonstrated repeatedly. They had insisted, for instance, that he dress like a schoolboy and relate to them as schoolmasters in order to qualify to be termed houseboy. So imagine, Dieudonné is not a young person. He's somebody in his mid-30s and early 40s. But for him to even be termed a houseboy, he has to be reduced to dressing like a schoolboy. He has to treat his masters like schoolmasters. Okay? So, and it did take some convincing to alter their minds. But somehow Dieudonné felt hopeful. He wished for sympathy and salvation. And he always exclaimed, Inshallah. To him, the Tubabis had sanctioned him beyond the bounds of severity. Not to pay him for a whole month was simply too harsh a punishment. And what had happened? All his years of dedicated service. This is a situation where Dieudonné is recounting after he had, because he loved drinking. He spent his time at the junction or the intersection of joy, right? Spending his time drinking. So he had spent an evening drinking, forgot that his master had visitors to visit him, and when he came late, they would not pay his monthly stipend or whatever they were to pay him. So he felt this was too harsh. Dieudonné does not limit himself there. He laments, he spends time, tells his personal story, talks about his own suffering, his travails. So there is another situation where the Tubabis, as I talked about rechristening, he accepts the rechristening and they impose on him. He's from a culture where the people eat meat on every occasion. And they told him he could not eat meat on Fridays. because they were Catholics. And on Good Friday, Dieudonné has prepared himself, right? A nice grill of beef, and he is there eating. He's caught eating meat. And this becomes a whole lot of trouble for Dieudonné. I want to show you how Nyamjo approaches his work with a lot of humor. Because you start reading the book, you laugh from the first page to the last. Nyamjo says, Dieudonné just looks at them. They say he's eating beef. He told them, who told you I'm eating meat? This is not meat. This is not beef. They said, but this is beef we are seeing. He said, no, what I'm eating here is fish. They said, how could this be fish? He said, well, when I came to be employed here, my name was Alagonga. You sprinkled water on my head, and you said I was Dieudonné. I took water sprinkled on this, and it became fish. That's what that is what I'm eating. So I am here eating fish. You cannot tell me I'm eating meat. The same process of conversion is the same process I used here. So he subverts their thinking to tell them this is the way he sees life. Okay? So, okay. I'll certainly be done in a minute so that we can have some questions. So, I already told you the graduate student, his name is Dieu Merci, but he has a last name. His last name is Africa, and Africa is spelled A-P-H-I-K-A. Dieu Merci, Africa. So that's a name to pay attention to, and since I'm rushed for time, I would simply state this, that Dieudonné's life is spawned from the threats of one of Africa's grand moral dilemmas, in which personal responsibility intertwined with the social catharsis occasioned by ambitions of dominance, the ambitions of dominance by the Tubabis, and the ever-diminishing circles, like the circles, people like Dieudonné, they are pushed to the fringes. That's why he spends his time. The Carrefour de la Joie I talked about is found in a neighborhood called Swine Quarter. We all know what swine is, all right? Like in the pigsty. So we encountered Dieudonné at the end of when the book starts, we encounter him at the tail end of his service as houseboy to the Tubabis. And we know this couple is patronizing, and he is in the Grand Canary bar where he tells his story, peeling them layer after layer, depicting the vicissitude of his life, and even the everyday resilience of not just the African, but the continent that is caught in the web of predatory forces. Yet, this enchanting failure also celebrates the infinite capacity of the African to find happiness and challenge victimhood. So, Dieudonné, or the Tubabis in this space, brings in challenges that the resilient African challenges, and that is why Africa is where it is, and it is not ready to go anywhere anytime soon. I thank you for your attention, and I hope we will have some vibrant discussion after this presentation. So we will take